So let me give you a little overview of the two speakers and another very special person that's with us today. Dr. Mark Messina. He has his own consulting firm, which is called Nutrition Matters. He's also the executive director of the Soy Nutrition Institute, which is also another national organization funded by the United Soybean Board. The second person is Koetke, who is the VP of Kendall and Laureate College. He's really that expert on culinary education. He actually wrote a Soyfoods curriculum for me that we have been getting out to lots of schools. Then the third person that I'm delighted to have with us is April Hemis. April is on the Iowa Soybean Association board. She's a board member, as well as United Soybean Board. And she is a farmer.
As she said, I farm, so I am the fourth generation on my farm. It's been in the family way over 100 years. It's about 1,000 acres. So I raise these soybeans that you're going to have fun with today, the field soybeans, and 1/2 of all the money that I sell the beans for goes to a checkoff program. What it does, it goes towards education, promotion, and research for soybeans. I'm really glad to be here and enjoy your soy food stay. Thanks.
All right, good morning. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about diet, how it impacts health, and then I'm talking about how soy foods can be an important component of your diet. And I would really encourage you to ask any questions, just shout them out or raise your hand, and if you would rather approach me individually, that's fine after the presentation, or you can email me. And you're also going to get a copy of the slides if you wish, so you don't have to be too concerned about taking notes. Just try to listen and get a couple of the big points that I'm trying to make. And the ones I am going to be making is that one, lifestyle impacts risk of chronic disease. Chronic disease, right? Cancer, heart disease, these are diseases that take decades to develop. Diet is perhaps the most important component of lifestyle, and soy can be an important component of diet. So let's begin at the beginning. Here we have the leading causes of death among Americans. Any guesses as to what the top two are? Heart disease. What's the other one? Cancer. There you go. Smart group. That's good. We can go more quickly since you're so intelligent. You can see heart disease and cancer dwarf the other causes of disease. In fact, heart disease and cancer almost contribute about 50% of all deaths of Americans. Now, the good news is that diet impacts at least 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death among Americans. So there's something you can do about your risk of developing these diseases. In addition to heart disease and cancer, it impacts stroke. Stroke is basically a brain attack, like you would have a heart attack. It's really just affecting your brain. It affects diabetes. We're going to talk a lot about diabetes because we have such a huge issue with that in this country. Also affects kidney disease, and we're going to talk about that. It may also affect Alzheimer's disease and some of these other diseases as well. So what you eat can dramatically impact your health. Heart disease is the #1 killer of Americans, but there's a huge variation in heart disease rates among geographic locations in the United States, and you can see that on this map. The more red the area is, the higher the rate of heart disease. So you can see in the southeastern part of the United States, it's really high. Iowa's actually not doing too badly. Much of Iowa is the lighter red or white, but in the southern part of Iowa, you can see there's quite a bit of red. And not only is there a large variation among heart disease rates within the United States, but you see a large variation in rates among countries in the world. So each of these green bars represents an individual country. So you can see that the highest rate is about 10 times higher than the lowest rate. Any guesses as to what country has the highest rate of heart disease in the world? You'll never get it. What? No, we're up there. So we're not #1 when it comes to heart disease, right? They drink a lot of vodka. You got it. I knew that. It was surprising, actually, that Israel has the lowest rate among developed countries in the world. And then you can see France is very low as well. The U.S. is #3 in the world. So we have a very high rate. It's twice as high as the rate in France, but it's a lot lower than the rate in Russia. So how do we know the variation in disease rates among countries isn't due to genetics? You know, our genes, the genes we were born with, do affect our health in very robust ways. But this variation is primarily due to lifestyle. One reason we know that, it should be fairly obvious, and that's the genetic makeup of people in Ireland and the UK and Germany is pretty similar to the genetic makeup of people in France. And yet the rate in France is half the rate of the people in Ireland and the UK. So that shows it's not genetics, it's lifestyle. We also know it's genetics from two other types of observations. One is migration studies and time trends within countries. So let's look at migration studies first. Migration studies refer to studies that show when people from low-risk countries, so a low-risk country like Japan or France, move to a high-risk country like the US, their offspring, their descendants, acquire the risk of their newly adopted homeland, usually within just 1 or 2 generations. In fact, if a young person moves from a country like France or Japan to the US, within their own lifestyle, their risk of heart disease and cancer will be similar to the US rate. So that's another way in which we know that this variation is due to lifestyle, not genetics. An even cooler thing is looking at time trends within countries. So for that, I want to just mention breast cancer for a couple minutes. There's a huge, like the case of heart disease, there's a huge variation in the rate of breast cancer among countries in the world. Here's where the US is just about leading the pack. The US has a very high rate of breast cancer. Rates are very low in China and Japan. Considerable evidence indicates one of the reasons that rates are low in China and Japan is because they consume soy foods. But what's interesting is even though the rate of Japan is so low, the rate in Japan has been increasing dramatically over the past 30 or 40 years. So here we have the rates of breast cancer in Miyagi Prefecture. This is like a large state in Japan over the past 40 years. Look at that. The rate increased threefold. Now your genes don't change within the 30 or 40 year period. The rates are increasing because their culture is becoming more westernized. In large part, it's because of the diet they're consuming. Their diet is becoming more westernized. As they eat more like us, their breast cancer rates become similar to our rates. But we don't even have to look at rates in other countries to determine that the difference in rates among countries is due to lifestyle, not genetics, because you can see a dramatic decrease in the rates of heart disease in the United States. Beginning around the 1960s, we see that cardiovascular disease, which includes stroke and heart attack and coronary heart disease, has decreased dramatically. Now, what do you think the reasons for the decrease are? Any guesses? Healthcare. Who said that? That's a good answer. Real good. Better surgery, better drugs, better detection. But the biggest factor is probably smoking. We smoke a lot less than we used to. Smoking, you associate smoking with lung cancer, but smoking is really nasty. Adversely affects a lot of your internal organs, increases the risk of a lot of diseases, not just lung cancer. And here you can see, fortunately, cigarette smoking is decreasing pretty dramatically, although still about 20% of Americans actually still smoke. Now, how many of you smoke? No, I'm only kidding. Don't raise your hand. I don't even want to know. So as I was saying, smoking increases risk of a variety of different cancers, not just lung cancer. It causes infertility. It weakens your bones, so it increases your risk of hip fracture. When you're young, you tend not to care about that, but you may care about how your teeth look. So that's pretty gross from smoking. And as you get a little bit older, you're going to start to care a lot more about wrinkles. And the difference in wrinkles between people who smoke and don't smoke is just absolutely dramatic. Now I want to talk about any questions, by the way. Anything about nutrition, anything I've said? Okay. So let's talk about the obesity epidemic that America faces. Obesity increases risk of all sorts of diseases, cancer, heart disease, diabetes in particular. I'm going to show a pretty dramatic illustration of why we know obesity increases risk of diabetes. Diabetes is the inability to control your blood sugar levels. So here's two maps produced by the Centers for Disease Control, part of the US government, that shows on your left the prevalence of obesity and on the right the prevalence of diabetes. If you're overweight, your chances of developing diabetes is increased by about tenfold. And what we're going to see is that over the last 20 years, the prevalence of obesity has increased dramatically. That will be illustrated by the fact that the maps become darker and darker red, and you'll see a corresponding increase in the prevalence of diabetes. This is really dramatic stuff. There goes Iowa. So if you really want to be healthy, it looks like you should be moving to Colorado because it's got the lowest prevalence of obesity among all states and the lowest prevalence of diabetes. They really enjoy their outdoor activities in that state. So because of the increased prevalence of obesity and therefore the increased prevalence of diabetes, we end up having about 10%. 1 out of every 10 Americans has diabetes. 25% of older people, 86 million Americans, have the beginning stages of diabetes, and it's the seventh leading cause of death. Diabetes increases risk of high blood pressure, kidney disease, heart attacks, blindness, amputations. So let's talk a little bit about overweight and obesity. Etiology, that means the cause of overweight and obesity. It's really complex. I can't stress that enough, and it's not about self-control. When I first started to learn nutrition, that's sort of what you learn, that it was just about discipline and self-control. That's why we know that is absolutely not the case. It's the result of your genes, your metabolism, your behavior, the environment and culture in which you live, and your socioeconomic status. That refers to the fact that people who are less educated and less well off economically are at a greater risk of becoming obese. Food availability. Believe it or not, when I grew up, there weren't any malls, there weren't any food carts. So food is a lot more prevalent than it used to be. It's also relatively inexpensive compared to our general economic status, and especially when you compare our situation to other countries in the world. So food is actually, especially crappy food, is actually relatively inexpensive and very available. The culture, we like big portion sizes. And in the 1950s, you would typically get a 7-ounce Coke. I mean, if you went to McDonald's and got a 7-ounce Coke now, you would think you were being ripped off. The larger the portion sizes, the easier it is to actually overeat. Behavior, we all know that behavior has changed. You know, in the pre-computer, cell phone, gaming device era, kids were a little bit more active than they were today. And even when young people are outside, they tend to be looking at their phones rather than actually being engaged in very rigorous activity. Unfortunately, there are no magic pills. Despite what Dr. Oz says and all these other hucksters that are on television, there's no magic pill to lose weight. And definitely, unfortunately, despite what all these authors claim and all these books claim, there is absolutely no magic weight loss diet. I can't stress this enough. Once you're overweight, unfortunately, it's very difficult to lose weight. It's not impossible, it's done. And if you have any questions about that, I'll be happy to address them. But your bodies are actually designed not to lose weight once you've gained it. It's actually a defense mechanism. So what you really need to do is to focus on eating for health, not really eating for weight loss. You may end up losing weight, but regardless of the weight you are, if you eat in a proper manner, it's going to improve your health. It's going to reduce your risk of developing chronic disease. So how do we eat in a healthy way? Well, we can turn to the government for advice in that regard. We can specifically look at the dietary guidelines that are issued by the government every 5 years. The most recent guidelines were issued in 2015. So first, some things that we need to reduce in our diet. Less sugar, less sodium, less saturated fat. Sugar is just a huge problem in this country. You know, a lot of the foods, and you probably know this given your background, but most consumers don't realize this. You know, a food like ketchup, you can see the third ingredient after tomatoes and vinegar is actually high fructose corn syrup, which is basically sugar. And then after high fructose corn syrup, you have another sugar, corn syrup. Foods that don't even taste sweet are actually loaded with sugar many times. So cornflakes, not only is a refined grain, but the second ingredient is sugar. Most people think of yogurt as being a very healthy choice. Again, the second ingredient is sugar. Sodium. A lot of people are very sensitive to the adverse effects of sodium. They see a rise in their blood pressure. An increase in blood pressure will increase risk of stroke and having a heart attack. Now, here's an important point, which is that most sodium that we consume, salt that we consume, doesn't come from adding salt at the dinner table or adding salt during the cooking process. It actually comes from, about 80% comes from processed foods. A lot of times they add sodium not only to preserve the food, but because it really enhances the palatability of the foods. So if you're going to try to reduce your sodium intake, it means that you need to reduce your intake of highly processed foods. On the plus side, we need to be eating more vegetables, fruits, grains, healthy oils. And you can see that the government actually singles out soy in two of their recommendations. Soy beverages as a source of calcium you need for strong bones. And it singles out soy products as good sources of protein. So let's start to now finish the presentation, go to the second half and talk about soy. Now, some of you may recognize this, but I think it's an astounding figure. There are 600,000 soybean farmers in the United States. They produce 4 billion bushels of soybeans annually. It's a very important crop economically and from a dietary nutritional perspective. The U.S. produces 1/3 of the world's soybeans. And where are those soybeans produced? Right here. The soybeans are produced in the Midwest. The dark green areas are the states that produce the most soybeans, areas producing the most soybeans, and you can see that's Iowa, Illinois. Those two states usually are 1 and 2 for top soybean producing states in the country. Soybeans are often viewed as sort of a miracle food or a wonder food, not because of their miracle benefits, but really because so many different products come from soybeans. Biodiesel, you get products that can be used in plastics, in cars. But as a nutritionist, I focus on the food that can be produced from soybeans. So I want to highlight 3. One is you get a lot of soy oil, and we're going to talk about that from soybeans. The other one, you get protein from soybeans, and then most of the soybeans are actually used for animal feed. Now, I'm not going to talk about that because I study human nutrition, but that's where most of the soybeans actually go. So how many of you have eaten any of these traditional soy foods? Tofu, edamame? Which ones have you eaten? Which ones? Anybody have tempeh here? Oh, good. That's actually my favorite product. It's not that widely consumed in the United States in comparison to something like soy milk, which is widely consumed. And edamame, we're going to have that later today. That's probably people's favorite soy product. It's the regular soybean harvested at about 80% maturity before it goes dry. And it's also a lot sweeter than the dry soybean. So it's a very popular food. Now, I recommend that you consume these foods. I consume them on a daily basis. But many Americans are not going to get their soy from the traditional soy products. They're going to get their soy from what are referred to as soy protein products. To make these products, you start with the bean, you get rid of the fiber, you get rid of the fat. In many cases, you get rid of the carbohydrate, and it just leaves you with the concentrated source of protein. And these proteins are great because the food industry has just made a lot of technological advances. So these proteins could be added to many commonly consumed foods. So sure, you can make soy burgers out of soy protein, but soy protein is also added to energy bars. You can make drinks out of it. You can just buy the powder itself and add it to beverages to increase your protein intake. We should be, by the way, when you think about protein, you should be getting protein at every meal. You should actually, the research indicates that you should evenly divide your protein intake up throughout the day. And not surprisingly, we get about 55% of our protein at the dinner hour and afterwards. We get very little at breakfast. That's terrible because your bones and your muscles are breaking down all throughout the day. And when they break down, if there's no protein there for the bones to be synthesized and for your muscles to be synthesized, you're going to end up losing muscle mass and bone mass over a long period of time. Even Cheerios has soy protein added to it. So this is a very convenient way for Americans to get the benefits of soy. So what are those benefits? Soy is a really high quality protein. Quality refers to the ability of a protein to provide the building blocks called amino acids that you need to make the proteins in your body. Your muscles are made of protein, your hormones are made of protein, enzymes are made of protein. The closer that dietary protein is to the types of proteins your body needs, the higher the quality. Animal proteins are very high quality. Plant proteins tend to be lower in quality. That's not true in the case of soy protein, and you can see that by this graph. This is the official governmental way in which the quality of a protein is evaluated. The highest score is 1.0. That's the score that soy receives. It's the score that egg white and milk receives. But interestingly, soy protein is actually higher in quality than beef, and it's much higher in quality than any other plant protein. In addition to being a really great protein, it also lowers LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is the bad cholesterol which raises your risk of heart disease. It lowers it about 5%. Because of the ability of soy protein to lower cholesterol levels, the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. government, formally approved a health claim for soy foods and coronary heart disease. They acknowledge that if you consume soy, you're going to reduce your risk of heart disease. The U.S. government did that in 1999. About 13 countries have done that since then. The most recent country to do so was Canada in 2014. It may also lower blood pressure. All 4 statistical analyses of the clinical studies, the intervention studies, show that's the case. And it may also favorably affect your kidneys. Now that actually is potentially very important, that it favorably affects how your kidneys work. The reason I say that is because one of the main complications of diabetes is kidney disease, and that could be deadly, unfortunately. So we have an increased prevalence of obesity, that increases risk of diabetes, that increases risk of kidney disease. So if you have diabetes, you're overweight, and you're at risk of developing kidney disease, then soy protein is going to be an especially good choice. But not only do we get protein from soybeans, we also get fat. And so I want to finish up talking about soy oil or soy fat. In addition to providing the fatty acids, which I'll talk about in a moment, soy oil is a great source of vitamin K and vitamin E. It produces phytosterols. These are called plant sterols that actually lower blood cholesterol levels. And then we get a lot of lecithin from soy oil. That's an emulsifier, as I'm sure most of you recognize. That's used in many, many foods, commonly consumed foods. This is probably the most astounding figure I'm going to throw at you today, which is that soybean oil accounts for over 7% of all the calories we consume in this country. So one food, soybean oil, accounts for 7% of our total caloric intake. Really remarkable. And that wasn't always the case, and you can see from this graph just how dramatic the rise in the consumption of soybean oil has been over the past 100 years. Look at that. In about 1970, the consumption of soybean oil, shown in red, really took off dramatically. If you tend to read product labels, you're going to see a lot of soy oil. But if you don't look at product labels, you may not know that soy oil has such a major role in our food supply, because unfortunately, back in the 1930s, the industry decided to market soybean oil as vegetable oil. So when you go into the grocery store and you see 100% vegetable oil, turn it over, you'll see the label actually says 100% soybean oil. And there was a recent, very small study conducted in which, in addition to labeling vegetable oil as soybean oil, one chain of stores decided to label it, to label it both as vegetable oil and soybean oil, and sales increased by about 25%. So soy has a healthy reputation, and so by labeling it as soybean oil, more consumers decided to buy that product. The fat that you choose in your diet is really important because dietary fat provides about 1/3 of all our calories. And some fats improve your health and some fats really harm your health. Since the 1980s, the government has recommended reducing the amount of saturated fat you consume. And they continue to make that recommendation. So more specifically, they say you should consume a diet that contains no more than 10% saturated fat. The American Heart Association says you should consume a diet that contains no more than 5 or 6% saturated fat. So how do you think we're doing with regard to our saturated fat intake? Not too well, as you can see here. Back in the 80s, it was about 13.5%. Remember, the American Heart Association says it should be 5 or 6%. So we're way above that amount. So we need to reduce the amount of saturated fat we consume because it increases cholesterol levels and increases risk of heart disease. And that's where soybean oil comes in because it's extremely low in saturated fat. It has a moderate amount of monounsaturated fat. Monounsaturated fat, that's the predominant fat in olive oil. The predominant fat in soybean oil is polyunsaturated fat. That's the kind of fat that lowers blood cholesterol levels, and we'll see that in a moment. The other really, really notable thing about soybean oil is that it provides both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. How many of you are familiar with those terms, omega-6 and omega-3? A few of you. Well, both of these fatty acids are essential for our survival. You need to get them from your diet in order to survive. The soybean is one of the few foods that provide both of these essential fatty acids. And in fact, we get about 40% of both of these essential fatty acids from the soybean. So it really makes a really remarkable contribution to our diet and to our health. And I mentioned that polyunsaturated fat is the kind of fat that lowers blood cholesterol levels, and you want to keep your blood cholesterol very low. Here we have proof that that is in fact the case. This was a study involving 18 young men that was published about 20 years ago. They were looking at the effects of these different fats on LDL cholesterol levels. That's the bad cholesterol that raises heart disease risk. We see exactly what we would expect. Cocoa butter, dairy butter, high in saturated fat, raises LDL cholesterol levels. Olive oil is fairly good, but it's not as good as soybean oil. You can see LDL cholesterol levels are lowest in response to the consumption of soybean oil. Not surprisingly, given what I've said, the American Heart Association has concluded that soy products should be beneficial to cardiovascular and overall health because of their high content of polyunsaturated fat and low content of saturated fat. If you replace saturated fat with refined carbohydrate, that's sugars and refined starches, even though you're decreasing your intake of saturated fat, you're not doing yourself any good. Your heart disease risk actually goes up slightly. And that's one of the problems that Americans have encountered over the past several decades. In our attempt to decrease our fat intake and to decrease our saturated fat intake, we ended up eating a lot of very unhealthy foods. We ended up eating a lot of foods that were high in sugar and high in refined carbohydrate. As a result, our risk of heart disease would not reduce. If, however, you replace saturated fat with carbohydrate from whole grains, your risk is reduced by 9%. If you replace saturated fat with monounsaturated fat, again, the kind of fat in olive oil, your risk is reduced by 15%. If you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, the kind of fat in soybean oil, your risk is reduced by 25%. So although olive oil has a really, really good reputation from a nutritional perspective, when you actually look at the data, soybean oil is much healthier than olive oil. And then finally, and these are, it says a brand new finding, 2016, based on 102 studies, 4,000 adults, soybean oil, polyunsaturated fat actually helps manage your blood sugar levels. So that refers to the fact that you want to keep your sugar levels in the normal range. Elevated sugar levels increases risk of developing diabetes, and in and of itself can have very harmful effects. And the new data show that if you consume polyunsaturated fat versus monounsaturated fat versus saturated fat, you're going to have more favorable blood sugar levels. And then very finally, I just want to mention that the soybean industry is developing a new oil that's already in the market. It's called high oleic soybean oil. You're going to learn a lot more about that in the next presentation, and then you're going to have a chance to taste it. It has an extended shelf life. It doesn't oxidize as easily as commodity soybean oil, and has a very neutral flavor. And in a very comprehensive scientific review published last year, it was found that replacing fats and oils high in saturated fatty acids with high oleic soybean oil, this no soybean oil, would have favorable effects on overall coronary heart disease risk. Now, I still think the commodity, the traditional soybean oil is actually healthier, but this is a very good second choice that has a lot of functional advantages. So just to summarize, in regard to intake recommendations, I really encourage you to try to consume 1 to 2 servings of soy foods daily. That could be an ounce of soy nuts or a cup of soy milk. Replace foods high in saturated fat with those high in polyunsaturated fat like soy foods and soybean oil. And again, just to reiterate the points I made at the beginning, lifestyle impacts risk of chronic disease, no question about that. Diet may be the most important component of lifestyle, and soy can be a very healthy component of an overall diet. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Anybody have any questions? I'll be around, so if you want to ask me. Yep. Absolutely. Where's Linda Funk, my trusty assistant? A website for recipes.
You go to www.soyfoods, Soyfoods is plural, soyfoodscouncil.com, soyfoodscouncil.com.
And do the brochures have your website on it?
Yes, it does.
So,
Yeah. We have tons of recipes, all the latest information on research. It's a really great resource.
and again, if you want a copy of the slides or PDF, just send me an email.
That man is a walking encyclopedia. Can you guys hear me okay? Is this working all right? Yep, great. Okay. Before we get started, in a little bit, I'm going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of you, when I say so, 9 of you, to come up here. When I say so, you're going to stand right in the line right up here, okay? Got it? Good. Okay. That's an easy instruction. So, good morning. What we're going to do in the next half hour is we're going to talk about some of the soy foods that Mark just mentioned, and I'm going to talk more about what you do with them. Because I'm hoping that all of you in Chef Whites are thinking about this very seriously as a career. And the rest of you who aren't in Chef Whites, I also hope you're thinking about this as a career. So it's great to learn about these foods from a health standpoint. That's important. But it's also important to sort of follow up on the question that was asked up there is, what about recipes? How do you work with them? So I'm going to go through that, and then I'm going to switch over into soy oil. And I'm really going to get into the sort of the guts of what this is all about, that high oleic thing that was mentioned. Because when I'm done talking, we're going to divide you up into a bunch of groups, and we're going to rotate you through this facility with hands-on and, most importantly, tasting opportunities to actually see what this oil does, how it performs, and when you leave here today, I promise, you walked in here today probably not knowing a whole lot about oil. When you leave here today, you're going to be at a whole different point in your life. After you taste 11 different oils, and you're going to be at a whole different point in your life. This is the first day of the rest of your oil life. So let's go ahead and get started. What I want to do is talk about some of those products that were mentioned. So first of all, when people talk to me and they say, you know, I'm not so sure that I like soy, maybe they don't eat soy and all that, what I always do is I start them off with some of these guys, which are edamame. How many of you eat edamame? Yeah, exactly. This is my gateway into soy. Why? Because essentially when you eat them, they taste like a beautiful vegetable. And one little point that I just want to bring up is if you see these guys, remember that the outside of this is not edible. So like in Japanese restaurants, you'll get this with a little salt on the outside as a sort of a starter little thing. And the way you eat them, you can either take it and sort of pop them out like that, or you can just put them in your mouth and sort of push them out into your mouth, okay? Which is better because they're salted on the outside. All right, edamame. We also have other types of whole soy. There are, for instance, these are soybeans. These are dried soybeans. So you cook them just like you would any other dried bean. Soak them in water, then cook them until they're nice and tender. And then we also have soy nuts, which are those roasted soybeans that are crunchy snack food. How many of you have had those? Okay. The reality is this. There's so many things you can do with whole soybeans. Just look up at the slides up here. You have sweet on one side, savory on the other side, and just think for a minute about all the possibilities. Remember that these ingredients are not Asian. They don't have to be Asian preparations. Why not make an edamame pureed soup and top it with a black truffle foam? Why not? It's phenomenal. Why not use those soy nuts and instead of making peanut brittle, make soy nut brittle? Why not? Why not take edamame and turn it into a puree that you can do a swoosh on the plate? Why not? It's beautiful. It's bright green. Lots of possibilities with whole soy. The next one, question. How many of you drink soy milk? Uh-huh. Hold your hands up high so I can see them. Yeah, there you go. All right, great. What is soy milk? A lot of people look at this and it's like, by the way, milk is about the worst name for this. Because if you've ever tried to milk a soybean, it is way not easy. You have to have very small hands. The reality is, soy milk is essentially, think of it this way, it's soy tea. Because the way you make soy milk is you take the soybeans, you grind them up, you hit them with hot water, just like you would a cup of tea, and it's going to leach out all the soluble stuff out of the soybean. And voila, that's soy milk. So the next time you're drinking soy milk, it's soy tea. And oh, by the way, when you drink soy milk in a place like Asia, it doesn't taste like here because we take it and we're good Americans, so we sweeten it up and we add vanilla to it and all that. All right, soy milk. By the way, you can do everything with soy milk you can do with normal milk. Dairy milk, same thing. Tofu. What is tofu? You get this big block of stuff, big white block. What is tofu? So after today, all that myth will be dispelled. Tofu is nothing more than cheese made from soy milk. So if you think of dairy cheese, what do? You milk a cow, you take the milk, you coagulate the milk, right? You make it solid and you do stuff to it and it's cheese. To make tofu, you start with soy milk. You add some stuff to it to coagulate it, to make it solid, and then you do some things to it and it's tofu. So tofu is nothing more than solid soy milk, if you want to think of it that way. But for all you future chefs out there, there's something I must call your attention to. Number one, that's how we coagulate it. We add a couple things to it. But this is the important part. Do you see there's two arrows down there? So we take the soy milk, we coagulate it, and then we have two distinct types of tofu, and this is so very important, and I must make sure you get this. Ready? The first one is, it's hard to do with one hand here. We'll try it like this. There we go. The first one is what's called a water-packed tofu. Looks like this, or pressed tofu. What is it? We basically take that soy milk, we coagulate it, and then we put it in a press, and we press it. And as we press it, moisture, water, comes out of our tofu. And if you look at the outside of these packages, one will say soft and one will say firm. What's the difference? The difference is how much did you press it? So if I press it a little bit, it's soft tofu. If I press it a lot, it becomes firm tofu. If I press it a lot, it's extra firm tofu. All right, that's pressed. The other kind of tofu tends to look like this one over here, and this is what we call silken tofu. Okay, this is where it gets more challenging. The difference between a water-packed tofu and a silken tofu is, ready? Silken tofu is never pressed. Therefore, all of the moisture is still in here. You with me on that? Now, why is that important? Why that's important is in what we do with it in the kitchen. So if you want to take chunks of tofu and deep fry them, or if you want to take a chunk of tofu and saute it or grill it, you have to use water-packed tofu, pressed tofu. Because if you use silken tofu, it will disintegrate. I've seen people one time, some students actually, who were cooking some stuff and stir-frying some veggies, and they were going to add some tofu, cubes of tofu. And they took silken tofu and they cubed it up and they tossed it in. They started flipping it around, and in about 30 seconds, it looked like somebody had taken a scoop of cottage cheese and just thrown it in there. It was absolutely gross. Why? Because the silken tofu has all the moisture, and it just disintegrates. What do we use silken tofu for? What we use it for is to puree it. We put it in a blender, we make purees out of this, and what you can do with this is magical. I mean magical. It's the base for dips, for sauces. You can use it in baked products, replace eggs, all kinds of amazing stuff with it. So remember, silken tofu, puree. Pressed tofu, when you want to keep it in its proper shape. Today you're going to deep fry some tofu, and it's made with this right here, and we'll explain that in the kitchen. Okay, the last product we had was tofu. Tofu is kind of wimpy. I always think of it that way. It's wimpy. In other words, it doesn't really have flavor. I mean, it does, but not a strong flavor. And actually what tofu kind of says is, here I am, you flavor me. It's a sponge. It absorbs the flavors you put with it. If you marinate it, it'll take on the flavor of the marinade. Fermented tofu is a different thing altogether. Fermented tofu says, I'm flavoring you. Fermented tofu is fermented soy products is when you bring all the flavors into that soybean, into those products that are intense and delicious, and for those you understand what umami is, full of umami. Things like soy sauce, things like miso. Miso and soy sauce are fermented soybeans. In the case of miso, it's solid. In the case of soy sauce, it's a liquid. By the way, who's had miso? Miso people out there? Yeah, miso, by the way, if all those people talk about probiotics. Have you heard probiotics? Yogurt, live stuff, good for you. That's miso. Miso's alive. It has all the health benefits. And earlier, Mark mentioned this, which is tempeh. And I think one person raised their hand and said tempeh. Congratulations. Tempeh is a most amazing product. I'm just going to talk about it for a second. I'm going to leave these up here if you want to sort of touch it and smell it, because it's kind of cool. Tempeh is originally from Indonesia. And tempeh, you take soybeans and you steam them, and then you mix it with mold. I just need to look on your face already. Like, huh? Mold? Yeah, mold. It's the same type of mold that's in brie cheese and camembert, that white mold on the outside. That's what's in between. If you look at this later, in between all the soybeans, there's a little white mold in there. That's holding it together. What they do then is they press it in a banana leaf, and they let it ferment for a day or two. And there's a million things you can do with this. And it tastes like mushrooms, and it's chewy, and it's absolutely delicious. In Indonesia, they'll take it and they'll brush it with something called sambal, which is a hot chili paste, and then they grill it, and you eat it that way. Street food. It's delicious. All right, soy protein. I'm just going to spend about 2 seconds on this, but soy proteins, and especially for culinary students out there, is something you will run into a lot more as you go into your career. Soy proteins happen in different types of products: soy flour, soy protein concentrate, soy isolates. And they do some of the most amazing stuff in baking, and especially in sausage making. They provide huge, huge benefits. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but you can read a few of them up there. Things like holding on to moisture in a product, binding stuff together like sausages. They're really, truly magical ingredients. And the last one is this one, textured vegetable protein. Who has had this? TVP? You probably have and didn't know it. TVP is essentially, remember that soybean has a lot of protein in it, and it has a lot of oil in it. And when we take out the oil, we're left with something that's very protein rich, very healthy. And so, 20 or 30 years ago, we used to make these products that kind of look like meat. Sometimes they're dried, sometimes they're frozen, depending. And these things were not so good. I mean, they really didn't taste very good. Today, completely different. There are products out there that are 100% made out of soy, that look like meat, behave like meat. Unbelievable. Ground beef, ground chicken out of soy. I just heard about a product yesterday. We were at breakfast, a stuffed chicken breast, all soy. There's even stranded soy protein. What does that mean? A chicken breast, when you eat it and it sort of pulls apart in nice little fibers, the soy does the same thing. So you have the same texture as meat. Fascinating products, and the progress has been unbelievable. Okay. So now we get into soy. We've talked about the different products. Let's talk about the soy oil now. It's funny, 10 years ago, nobody talked about soy oil. If I was here, and I've been here many times, but years ago, we never talked about oil. Why? Because soy oil was out there, and we all kind of cooked with it, and it was that. And then all of a sudden, something happened. Something big happened in our country. Something that was a shock to food manufacturers and us chefs, when all of a sudden our government said, there's this thing called trans fats, and they're really bad for you. And you got to take them out of your restaurants. You got to take them out of your baked products. You got to take them out of your donut places. And the whole industry went, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? I'm going to explain to you what trans fats are. I'm going to explain to you where we saw them. And I'm going to take you on a little journey. Because how we got to this high oleic oil today started with the trans fat dilemma that we faced. So, to do that though, I have to give you a little food science. Are we ready for that? Just everybody say yes, just to make me feel good. Say yes. I want you to say, I've been waiting for this my whole life.
I've been waiting for this my whole life.
There you go, thank you. Now, in all reality, this is the deal. Chefs, us, the guys that wear, ladies that wear these chef jackets, we are artists, we are business people, and we are scientists. Everything you do in the kitchen is explained in science. Everything. So we're going to take a step back here and we're going to do a little science. So these are the things you need to remember. Take a look at the screen up there real quickly. When we talk about fats, we talk about something called a lipid. A lipid means all that fatty stuff. If you look under the term lipid, it says triglyceride. That is a specific molecule that we are going to be focusing on. That's what most of our lipids or fats are. Now, in a triglyceride, there are 3 types of fatty acids, all of which you've heard before. Saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat. You heard it in the last presentation. You've heard it on the news, cut down on saturated fat. And does anybody ever stop and say, what is a saturated fat? Well, by today you will know, I promise. And of those 3 types of fats, there are 5 specific ones that we're going to talk a lot about. And you see those to the right on the PowerPoint slide. Stearic acid, palmitic acid, oleic acid, linoleic, linolenic. Remember those 5. We're coming back to them in a little bit. Now, if I just totally confused you, that's a good thing, because we're going to take it nice and slow. Here we go. The first one is a triglyceride. Triglycerides are very simple, sort of. Any food scientists out there? Any of the adults? No? Good? Excellent, because they always laugh at me at this point. You have a glycerol backbone, and then you have those 3 fatty acids, those red things. Those are the things that we're going to focus on today. Remember those 3 fatty acids? 3 kinds of them. What were they?
Saturated, monounsaturated, and poly.
Thank you. Saturated, mono, and poly. Okay, good. So all of the fats that we're talking about, all the fats, the butter you put on your bread, the lard, the soy oil, all of it is triglycerides. Ready? Okay, now this is where it gets fun. I need my volunteers up here. Let's go. Quick. 3 kinds of fats. Remember I said there's saturated, there's poly, and there's mono. What's the difference? And why does it matter to you? Come on, right down here. Stand right here. And I need you to get really close to the table here, like right here. That's it. Excellent. Good, good. Just face those guys here. Look at this. This is beautiful. All right, I want to introduce you to your first fatty acid you've met in person. There they are. There's your fatty acid. Now, all fatty acids you see are bound. Each one of these folks here are going to be bound together. So interlock your arms. Interlock, all of you. There you go. Okay. What you're looking at right now, what you're looking at is a saturated fatty acid. If you look up at the slide, there's that little row, that molecule on top. Wow, I'm missing a bunch of stuff there. That's interesting. And that molecule on top has big atoms, which are carbon, and then there's a bunch of hydrogen attached. It looks like a tire tread, maybe. Okay? These guys are a saturated fat. Why are they a saturated fat? Because think of them as a wall. And me, I'm something really bad. I'm bad. I'm an oxygen atom. And oxygen atoms are highly reactive. And they want to break apart this molecule so desperately. And so this molecule, this atom comes and pushes on them. And what happens? Nothing. You see, nothing happens because these guys are all one solid molecule. I can't break them. Bummer. That's a saturated fat. Okay. Now what happens if we make a mono unsaturated fat? What happens? There's my mono unsaturated fat. Do you see a little equal sign in there? Do you remember what that is from chemistry class? That's a double bond. Double bonds actually are weak. And so you two just drop your arms next to each other and get right next to each other. There you go. There's my double bond right there. Mono, one, means one double bond. What does that mean? There's a weakness in that molecule. You see, their arms are not interlocking anymore. Now me, nasty oxygen atom, I'm pushing on them, and all of a sudden I come between these two and I go, oh, awesome! I just broke them apart. That's a monounsaturated fat. There's one weakness. I can break it. Good. Now what happens when we move into the world of polyunsaturated fats? And polyunsaturated fats, poly means many, and that means many double bonds. So maybe I have another double bond here. So you're just going to move your arms, just there you go, stand right next to each other. Now me, nasty oxygen, flying around, I'm like, nope, 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 oh yeah, break that one apart, nope, 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 oh yeah, break this one apart. I now take that molecule and split it into 3. Polyunsaturated fatty acid. You guys are the best fatty acid I've had like all day. Give me a hand. Look at that. You have a talent you never knew. How you can put that on your resume when you apply to college. I was a fatty acid. There you go. Okay. Now now we know what saturated monopoly is. So the next time that you hear it on the news, you'll be like, saturated fat. You go, oh, I remember that wall. Now, if you're paying attention, you should have been going along with me, and you should have been inside your head saying, well, why does this matter? And this is why it matters. That little oxygen atom, me, flying around, breaking up that molecule, super bad things happen when I break those molecules. What happens is something called rancidity. If you've ever smelled a fat, an oil, and you're like, oh, man, does that stink? It smells like fish. It smells like, ugh. That's rancid oil. When I get in there and I break up those molecules, I create horrible smells, horrible flavors, stuff you don't want to eat. If you have a deep fry oil, it means your oil's breaking down in your fryer and starting to smoke and starting to foam, and bad things are happening. That's why that molecule is important. By the way, as a side note, that's why you have aged beef and never aged chicken. Because beef is highly saturated. You hang it up, oxygen hits it, can't break apart the molecules. Chicken, Oh yeah, there's not that much saturated fat in chicken. It breaks all its molecules and it smells horrible. Okay, now hang with me because this is where it gets really interesting. Okay, this is our story, right? Now you know the background. The problem is if you put oil in a deep fryer, it doesn't do so well. Just straight oil. Why? Because oils have polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. They break apart. They don't last long. And so years ago, scientists figured something out that's kind of interesting. They could fix the molecules. Remember that wall that was broken in a couple spots? They figured out how to fix the wall and make it more resistant to rancidity, last longer in your deep fryer. And what this happened was a process called, well, hydrogenation. Watch the way it happens. Remember, in that little diagram up there, you have the big ones are carbons, the little ones are hydrogen. Ready? Watch. They figured out if I shoot hydrogen into that fat, into those oils, what happens is this. Hydrogen goes in, double bond drops out, and what did I just create? A saturated fat. Wow. And they figured out, like, hey, this is great. I could actually take a liquid oil and I could make it solid. I could take a liquid oil and it's more resistant to rancidity. Awesome. Except there's a problem with that. If you fully hydrogenate an oil, you create something that has the texture of wax. It's very hard. Now remember, you've seen deep fryers? Think of that, right? Somebody says, okay, would you fill up the deep fryer, please? And you walk over this big chunk of something that's like, well, that doesn't work. Try to make puff pastry with that? That doesn't work. And so scientists said, we got to figure this one out, and this is what they did. They figured it out by doing partial hydrogenation. So they put some hydrogen in, but not all of them. Great. What happened? We got something that was liquid. It was soft. It was much more useful. And we used that for many years. And we learned that when you make those kinds of partial hydrogenation, what you actually do is you make a soup. A soup that consists of saturated fat. You have something called a cis molecule, which is right there, which is fine. And we also made those. That's the problem. The trans fats are the problem. And all the differences, if you look up there, look at that. The cis and a trans fat both have a double bond. The only difference is one hydrogen flips to the other side of the molecule and it straightens it out. Now, why is that a bad deal? Because the scientists actually figured out that trans fat lowered your good cholesterol and raised your bad cholesterol. It's a double whammy and really not good for you. And our government said, can't use those trans fats. Okay, that's a bummer because that's what was in all of our deep fryers. Oh, that's a bummer because that was in many of our baked products and in donuts and all that stuff. And so now all of a sudden, how do we fix this? By the way, when you partially hydrogenate, that's what it looks like. Somewhere around 32% trans fats. There's a lot of trans fat in there. Now let's take one step back real quick. Remember there was 5 fatty acids I told you before? Just remember these names. I'm not going to get into the specifics. You have 2 saturated. Remember the good solid walls, stearic and palmitic. We have 1 monounsaturated, that one weakness over here, which is called oleic acid. And then, by the way, you're all taking notes up there. I love you for taking notes. We'll leave this with you also, so you don't have to write them all. But keep writing. It's great. I love to see that. And then there's 2 polyunsaturates. One which is called linoleic acid and one which is called linolenic acid. Now, pay close attention here. Remember the breaks in the wall? Linoleic was the one we made. It had 2 breaks in the wall. Linolenic, the one on the bottom, has 3 breaks in the wall. So what do you know about an oil that has 3 breaks in the wall? Is it stable or unstable? Unstable, big time. Which means it's really prone to me, nasty oxygen flying around. And other things. Pay close attention. If you look at just straight soybean oil, look at the top up there, you see the breakdown. And by the way, this is really important for you guys. When somebody says, beef is saturated fat, that is not totally true. Because beef has polys and monos and saturates all in it, but just happens to have more saturated fat. Look at the soybean. You see the green up there? That's palmitic. That sort of pinky thing is stearic. Got some oleic, a whole bunch of linoleic. And then you got about 7% linolenic. That's the stuff that's highly reactive. And so watch what we did, which is so fascinating. How do you get the trans fats out? How do you not have to partially hydrogenate? Change the soybean. It's a fascinating solution. Change the soybean. So for the last 25 years, people have been working on this. The first generation, which was called low lin oils, low linolenic oil, remember that linolenic? It's at 7% highly reactive and reduced it to 1 to 3%. What did we do? We just made the oil more stable. Does that make sense? It's kind of like looking at a class of people and saying, you're the bad bully, we're taking you out of the room. And all of a sudden the whole class gets better? That's what we just did to the soybean oil. But then we went one step further and created something called these high oleic oils. In a high oleic oil, what we then targeted was the next problem child, which is linoleic acid, the one with 2 breaks. And we said, okay, we took care of linolenic. We got that sorted down to 1 to 3%. What can we do with the other one? And what did we do? We reduced the amount of linoleic and grew the amount of oleic acid. You follow me on this? So what we're doing is we're taking out the fatty acids that are problematic and we're replacing them. So watch what it looks like now. Now all of a sudden the saturates are sort of over there. Look at how much oleic acid, 77%. That used to be a much smaller piece. And that 8% used to be huge. So what we're doing essentially, by changing the bean, by changing the structure of the oil, you get an oil, that lasts longer. Now, why does that matter, guys? Because we're in a business. Food service is a business. We have to make money. We have to make a profit. And believe it or not, if you have to be changing the oil out of your deep fryer, number 1, it's a pain. Number 2, it's messy. Number 3, it costs money. So if I can leave an oil in my deep fryer longer, that's high quality oil. Because there's a lot of places that will deep fry in horribly gross oil. Bad practice. What happens? I make more money. So take a look here, just a couple things. You can see by the graph, see what that Plenish high oleic soy oil does. Lasts considerably longer. Considerably longer. Or there's this thing called polymerization. I love this because most culinary students don't know this word. But you've all seen it. Polymerization is when oil is heated for an overly long period of time over and over again, and what actually happens, we make plastic out of the oil. That's that brown stuff that sticks to the inside of a pan. You know what I'm talking about. You see those pans or griddles that never really got totally clean? Like they don't clean the corner of the griddle, and over time it gets this brown thing going on. You can never clean that off. It's plastic. So which of the 2 fryers up there do you want to clean? It's your job at the end of the night. Hey, you got to clean the fryer. I want to clean the one on the right personally. Because again, high quality oil is not going to be breaking apart and forming those polymers in your deep fryer. In addition to that, there's a flavor which you're all going to taste, which is, what should good deep fryer oil taste like? What? Say it loud. Nothing. That's exactly right. It shouldn't taste like anything. If you taste a French fry and you taste the oil, what you're actually tasting is like ick. That's rancid oil. That's breaking apart. That's old. And remember, by the way, in a deep fryer, the reactions happen super fast. So rancidity grows very, very quickly. So that's a little slide just on, you can see how much more stable the Plenish oil is compared to the others. And this is the last slide, which is, even if you have great oil, you can still screw it up by bad practices. So I just want to remind you of a couple things, because I guarantee it, wherever you work, there will be a deep fryer. And there's stuff you can do. Like if you take a bag of frozen shrimp, breaded shrimp, and put it in a fry basket, what happens? A bunch of breadcrumbs fall out. If you do that over the fryer, those breadcrumbs grow into your oil, and those breadcrumbs will break apart, and they will actually cause your oil to age prematurely. So keep it out of the oil. Never put things like bacon in. Never keep the fryers on any longer than you need to. How many restaurants do lunch service and then they do nothing for 4 hours and the fryer is just chugging away at 350 degrees? You're destroying your oil. In between service, turn it off, turn it down, always. Avoid water, so you're putting in French fries, potatoes, dry them well and then put them in. And never ever season with salt over oil, because salt has some pretty bad reactions with the oil that will cause it to also break apart. So the point is, use great oil and treat it well. And by the way, the oil you're going to use today, what makes that oil special isn't that somehow it's processed in a strange way. It's the actual soybean. And so the oil you're getting is very clean soy oil without all the additives, etc.